Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gretchen and today I want to talk about my favorite reads from 2024. I know that this video is long overdue. I wanted to get it out closer to the start of the year, but life is just really busy at the moment, and this is really the first time that I've had a chance to sit down and film. It also has taken me quite a while to finalize my list. There were about 4 or 5 times when I thought, yep, my list is solid and that's what I'm going with, and then another book just started like creeping into my mind, and then I would have to switch things around and change the order, and finally I have come up with my list and it's time to share it with all of you. Now, before I actually get into the books, I do just want to make a couple things very clear. First of all, this is not my favorite reads that were released in 2024. These are just the 12 books that I read in 2024 that were my favorite. And I will also point out that my list is in a ranking order, so the closer that we get to number 1, it means the more I liked the book. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the books. Coming in at number 12, we have Whalefall by Elizabeth O'Connor, and this was published in 2024. I stumbled across this book when I was doing research for one of my anticipated releases videos last year, and as soon as I saw the setting, I knew it was a book I had to read because it's one of my all-time favorite type of settings for a novel, which is a tiny little island off the coast of like the UK or Ireland or Scotland, or even like the North Atlantic coast in the States. I can't tell you how much joy a setting like that in a book brings me. So when I saw that this book was set off of the coast of Wales on this remote, isolated island, I was immediately hooked, and I knew that it was a book that I had to read, and I'm so glad I did because I ended up loving it. This book is set in the late 1930s and it follows our main character, Maenad. And if I'm remembering correctly, she's like 18 or 19 years old. She has lived on this island her whole life, but she longs for bigger and better things outside of the little world that she lives in. She's also lived a pretty sheltered life in many ways. She's living on this island that is literally cut off from most of the world, and there really aren't a lot of inhabitants on this island either, so she doesn't have a lot of people to interact with, especially those that are around her age. One day, a whale washes up on the shore, and it causes a lot of excitement on the island. Not only that, but it also captures the attention of some Oxford researchers that find out about it, and they want to visit the island to study not only that event, but also the inhabitants of the island. Once there, Maenad acts as a translator for these researchers, and she immediately is taken with them, and kind of both in their own way. There's a man and a woman, Joan and Edward, and although she really enjoys the time that she's spending with them, she very quickly realizes that their intentions might not be as pure as she thought that they were. It appears that they're starting to take liberties with how they're portraying the inhabitants of the island, and they're basically kind of exploiting them. And of course, Maenad has feelings about this, and she has a problem with it. This is a really quiet little book. The writing is absolutely fantastic, and this book gave me very strong vibes like The Colony by Audrey McGee. So if that is a book that you enjoyed, I can almost guarantee that you're gonna really enjoy this book as well. This book was also emotional. It snuck up on me, and I really wish that more people would read it because I feel like it's a book that kind of slid under everybody's radar, and there really weren't enough people that read it because it is a really good book, and I think a lot of you would enjoy it. Moving on to 11, we have Northwoods by Daniel Mason, and this is a book that was published in 2023. Now, I did a full-length review of this already, so I will just say a couple brief things. It's a book that is set up like a novel, but it could easily be labeled as a collection of interconnected short stories. This is a book that follows a piece of land and a house over the course of a few hundred years, and we learn about all of the people and beetles along the way that have interacted with it throughout the years. And it was a book that was heartwarming, it was sad at times, it was funny, but I was charmed with it from start to finish. I absolutely adored it, and although this is a book that had flaws, it still managed to be a really good story to me, and I was able to see all the way past those flaws and ended up loving it and felt that I had to include this one on my list because it was such a memorable read, and it's a book that I still think about all the time. Coming in at number 10, we have Nightbloom by Peace Adzo Mehdi, and this is a book that was published in 2023. So I read this book because it was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and in my opinion, it was robbed and it should have been on the short list, and I'm still bitter about it. And I'm looking at you, Dolly Maunder. You know who you are and you know what you did. But I digress. Anyway, so this book follows two cousins. We have Akorfa and we have Selassie. The first part of the book is told from Akorfa's point of view, and we meet both of them at a very young age. They're like sisters, they're inseparable, and then as they start to get older, something happens that kind of drives a wedge between them. Akorfa, she has dreams of being a doctor, and she's always wanted to go to Harvard, so she leaves Ghana to go to the States for university, and she hasn't spoken to Selassie for years. Some event happens that eventually brings the two of them together as adults, and once that event happens and they kind of reunite, the story takes over for part 2 from Selassie's point of view, and then we learn her side of the story and what happened in their childhood, so we get that dual perspective, and then we also learn more about what's going on in Selassie's life currently, you know, what she's been doing in the meantime, and we get caught up on her life. Now, I did do a full-length review of this book, so I will once again put that in the description, so I won't say too much more about the plot, but this was such a great story, and it ticked off so many of my boxes when it comes to reasons why I love a book. It highlights strong female friendship. It has that dual narrative where we're getting both perspectives and both sides of the story. And Selassie is such a memorable character. There were times when I loved her, there were times that I hated her, but she was just so fascinating and I loved her storyline. It was also a really unique narrative. It touched on things and subjects that I hadn't read before, and the writing was great. It was just a solid, good book, and I wish that more people had read it. I wish that people would pick it up. Even for it being on the Women's Prize long list, I don't feel like this book got enough credit, and I don't feel like it had enough readers. So if any of those things sound remotely interesting to you, take a chance on this book. I think that you would really like it. All right, moving on to number 9, we have Ellena Nose by Claudia Pinheiro, and this is translated from the Spanish by Frances Riddle. Now, I have been watching BookTube for a while, and this is one of those books that I have heard so many people read, and the general consensus has been that they have loved it. And this is also a book that was shortlisted for the International Booker, so for some reason, though, I kept putting it off, and once I finished it, I literally closed this book and said to myself, why did I wait so long to read this? Because you all were not lying. This book is phenomenal. It was a tough read, but it was so good. This book follows our main character, Ellena, and she's in her 60s and she has Parkinson's disease, and it's really taking a toll on her body. And one day she finds out that her daughter Rita has taken her own life, and there are some strange circumstances around it, and feels in her heart that Rita is not possible. It could not not have possibly done something like that. She just doesn't believe it. So what she does, even though her body is fighting against her, she makes it her mission to find out what happened. So she takes to the streets of Buenos Aires to get the answers that she needs to settle this this kind of mystery in her mind. This book takes place over the course of a single day, so it's a very quick read, it's very fast-paced, and it also goes back and forth between Ellena's journey out in the streets to find out what had happened to these flashbacks about interactions that she had with her daughter, and then also flashbacks of, you know, what was going on in her daughter's life. So we as the reader can see all of this stuff happening and unfolding. Pinero's writing is visceral, and she has this knack for making you feel everything her characters are going through. This book will be especially powerful for anybody that is a caretaker or who has been a caretaker for a family member or someone very close to them. So if that's something that could potentially be triggering for you, this might not be a book that you want to read, because it does get very real at times. And at the end of the day, I was just in awe of this book. It's short, it's simple on the surface, but it cuts so deep, and it's just so good. It's definitely worth a read. All right, moving on to my number 8 pick, and this is a book that I haven't had a chance to talk about on my channel yet, so I'm really glad that it ended up making the cut because I want more people to read it, and that is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Now, this book was fantastic, and it was a book I was not expecting to fall in love with, but it was so unique and I absolutely had to include it on my list. So this book is set in 412 BC on the island of Sicily in a city called Syracuse, and the Syracusans have recently been attacked by the Athenians. We're in the midst of the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenians tried to attack them and take over the city, but they failed, and there is a large group of them that have been taken prisoner, and the Syracusans put them, basically threw them into this rock quarry and left them there to kind of rot and die, basically. And then we have our main characters. We have Gelon and we have Lampo. And they are, one day they're bored and they decide that they're going to go to the quarry to feed the Athenians. And when they get there, they are kind of basically feeding them scraps, but in order to get food, they have to recite lines from plays by Euripides. And then one thing leads to another, and Lampo and Gelon hatch this plan that they are going to put on a full-blown production of Medea with the prisoners as the cast members. And the story basically just takes over from there. And I know that that premise sounds really strange and it sounds a little dark, but the best part of this book is that it is all done with the Irish contemporary voice. Lampo and Gelon, they speak like they are modern day Dubliners, and it seems or sounds like it would be so out of place. And at first it was a little jarring, but then as the book started to progress, it just made so much sense, and it added such a level of humor to kind of dampen or kind of quell a lot of that, you know, bleakness and sadness that you were getting with the heavy topics that were being discussed. And I absolutely thought that the addition of that made me fall in love with the characters all the more. I loved these characters. I wanted to protect them. I wanted to protect them from themselves. I wanted to protect them from each other. And it was just such a fun ride. And it was a book that just had a very beautiful message to it as well. At the end of the day, these characters were just, you know, on this journey to become better people in the world. It was very evident that the war had kind of numbed them and desensitized them to a lot of things, and the act of bringing this piece of art or this play to life really was able to extract something very lovely out of a lot of ugliness that was going on around them. And another thing that Ferdy Ellena probably didn't intend to do, or maybe he did, but as an American, I'm living in a very divided country at the moment. And although this is a life lesson that I have known my whole life, we have in our lives sometimes people that we immediately immediately perceive as enemies, and we do that with zero context. And it's maybe because of we don't agree with their ideas, we don't agree with what they're wearing, we don't agree with who they're sleeping with. It could be a multitude of things. But at the end of the day, we do all of this. We judge these people for those things, and we don't know them as a person. And if we really took the time to get to know them, we would see we have more similarities than differences. And God forbid these might be people we actually enjoy to be around. And not only that, we might respect them. And I know that there are a lot of people that would say that that is a basic trope or theme and there's nothing nuanced about it. But my opinion is, if it's so basic, then why don't more people live their lives that way? And I really liked that this book forced me to reinforce that message within myself, and it came at a really appropriate time with everything that was going on in the world, or in my world, I should say. So I loved this book for that reason too. And not only did it do that, but it did it with humor. And for as cold and horrific as some of the book seemed, it was perfectly balanced with heart and empathy, and I thought it was absolutely genius. And I will be the first one in line for the next book that Ferdy Ellena puts out. And on a side note, if I were to be judging the 2024 reads on their best covers, I mean, come on, can you get any better than that? Yes, you can, because there is even a little googly-eyed owl on the back, which is perfect. It just makes me love this book even more. Yeah, I totally think it's worth a read. And if any of that sounds at all interesting to you, you need to pick this one up. I don't think you'll regret it. Moving on to number 7, we have Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, and this was published in 2023. I read this book months ago, and I am still trying to figure out why this book is living rent-free in my head. This book made me feel the exact same way that Study for Obedience made me feel last year. This book is odd, and it often made me uncomfortable. And so many times throughout this book, I stopped and thought to myself, what the hell am I reading? What the hell is going on? Where is all of this going? But there was something absolutely mesmerizing about it to me. In a very general sense, this book is about a woman who decides to give up her busy life in Sydney, and she moves to this isolated rural convent in New South Wales in Australia to live with nuns. And once she gets there, if that isn't strange enough, all of a sudden there's this mouse plague, and this book touches on the climate crisis. It touches on grief and forgiveness and repentance and remorse, and the mice the mice were a thing with this book, and it was disturbing, and like I said, it made me uncomfortable, but it was delightful at the same time, and I felt every page was worth my time in the end. And this was a book that was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year. So I did do a full-length review for this one already, which will be linked in the description if you want to hear my full thoughts on that. But yeah, I am so glad to have read this book, and it definitely deserves a spot on my favorites list of the year. All right, so moving on to number 6, we have Winter in Socko by Eliza Shua Dusapan. This is translated from the French by Anissa Abbas Higgins, and this book was published in 2020. This was one of the biggest surprises of the year for me, and it's a book that I read. I just finished it late in the year, so I'm still trying to process whether it's, you know, recency bias, why I fell in love with this book so much and why I felt compelled to put it on this list, but I don't think so. I think that this book is going to be one that sticks with me for a very long time, and I absolutely fell in love with this book. I talked about this book on my last recap, so I won't go into very much detail with it, but what I will say is it follows an unnamed narrator. She lives in Socko, which is this South Korean beach town, and it takes place in winter, so it's during the off season. She works at this inn, and she is young. I think she's like 19 or 20, and she's at that point in her life where she really doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know what she wants to do. She's not sure what her future is going to look like. She has a boyfriend, but she's not really sure if he's the one for her and whether or not she sees a future with him. She also has a mom that kind of depends on her for a lot of things, so she feels kind of stuck and afraid to venture outside of Socko because she really puts the needs of others in front of hers. She also has a complicated relationship with her parents. Her mom, who is Korean, but her father, whom she never met, is French. So she knows only her Korean culture. She has this whole other part of her that she knows nothing about. And then one day, she's working at the inn, and this man, this Frenchman, checks in, and he's older, and he's a graphic novelist, and he is there for research. He is writing a book, and he wants to visit there so he can get the local experience to help him with inspiration for the book. And when they meet initially, they kind of get off to a rocky start, but eventually they start to bond, and she kind of takes over as tour guide for him, so they're spending a lot of time together, they're interacting with each other a lot, and there's just this beautiful story that develops from all of that. And it was a little quiet book. It's not a very long book at all. It's not very plot heavy either, so if you're a reader that needs a plot, this might not be a good book for you, but I absolutely loved the character development of our main narrator, and I connected with her so much. And this was a book that I did not make it through without crying. Tears were shed, and it really hit me in my feels. And I feel like this is a book that, even though it's one I read recently and it's fresh in my mind because of that, it's one that's going to linger and stay with me for a very long time. And I'm really looking forward to picking up some of her backlist books as well. All right, we are moving on to number 5, and that is going to be Brotherless Night by Vivi Ganashanathan, and this was published in 2023. And this book is probably going to make it onto, I would assume, a lot of people's best of lists for this year. It was the winner of the Carol Shields Prize. It was also the winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction. So I have talked a lot about this book on my channel already. I did a full-length review for it, so you can check that out. This was one of the most emotional and gut-wrenching books I think that I have ever read, not just this year, but ever. For those of you that don't know, it follows a young woman trying to become a doctor in Sri Lanka during the tumultuous years of their civil war, and it explores how the war impacts her family as well as a close family friend of hers. It's a tearjerker, but it's beautifully written, and the story was so engaging. And once I started it, I did not want to put it down. This book deserved every award that it won, and I cannot wait to see what this author does next. And if you are sitting on this, if it's on your TBR and you've been debating whether or not to read it, just pick it up. You're going to love it. All right, we're moving on to number 4. We're getting close. Okay, so this is a book that I don't think I have talked about at all on my channel. I don't even think that you guys knew that I read this year. And that is Stoner by John Williams, and this was published in 1965. I will start by saying, if you have read this book, you know exactly why it's on my list. And if you haven't read this yet, you're doing yourself a disservice. In a nutshell, this book is simple. It's about the entire life of this mediocre man living a mediocre life, doing mediocre things. But for all of those things, on the inside, he's truly extraordinary, and he has so much meaning and purpose, but he contains all of that up within himself. This book follows our main character. His name is William Stoner. He's born at the end of the 19th century to poor farmers in Missouri, and his life plan is that he's going to take over the farm, but what his father decides for him is that he wants his son to go to university to learn about agriculture to help make the farm flourish. So Stoner goes to college, he goes to university, and when he gets there, he unexpectedly falls in love with literature, and he decides that he is going to take the path of becoming an academic. The book then follows the course of his entire life as a professor. It takes him through that, it takes him through his marriage, it takes us through his work rivalries, him becoming a father, and into older age, and eventually to his death. Now, don't come for me, that's not a spoiler. It literally tells us in, I think, like the second or third sentence that that's what we're going to get out of this book. So it's not a spoiler, but you need to know that going in. And I know that the premise of this book might sound boring or unimaginative, but I promise you that this book is everything but those things. Stoner's search to find meaning in his life is honestly one of the most beautiful stories that I have ever read. And John Williams put so much heart and care into this character that I felt like I personally knew him. We were there for all the wins of his life. We were there for all of the failures. And this book just kind of amalgamates all of those things into this single lifetime that upon death, the world is probably going to quickly forget about, but it doesn't mean that his life didn't have meaning. When I think about this book, I get emotional in a way that I don't even think I understand. And the only other book that I can think of that even made me feel remotely like this was Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, not in the sense of the plot, but they both stirred up that same kind of emotion for me. Don't sit on this. Everyone that I have ever heard talk about this book has loved it. It is worth the hype. Please, please read it if you haven't. All right, we're cruising into number 3, and we have Lojman by Ebru Ojan, and this is translated from the Turkish by Eren Aji and Selena Gakescu, and this was published in 2023. This was the winner of the Republic of Consciousness Prize for 2023 for US and Canada, and this is hands down the most claustrophobic books that I have ever read in my life. It's set in a snowy and desolate area of Turkey, kind of at the foothills of these mountains, and we have a woman that has just given birth in her home. She is alone there with just her 2 young children. They live in this tiny house which is called a lojman. It's teacher housing. Her husband is the village teacher, and a couple days prior to her birth, or the birth, I should say, her and her husband have this argument and he disappears and he has yet to return. Very shortly after the birth, it becomes very apparent that she doesn't care about the baby. She doesn't care about her children, and things start to get very, very tense very quickly. And she starts to slip into not only this postpartum depression, but it's like a full-blown psychosis. And we have her daughter, who is a little older than her son. She's seeing this unfold, and she's transitioning from these feelings of major resentment that she has for her mother for everything that's happened between her and her father that caused him to leave. And it's going from just this feeling of resentment to absolute hatred toward her mother. This was an extremely dark book, and it was completely unhinged at times. My jaw was on the floor for most of this, and I was absolutely shocked that the author took this book where she did. She was not afraid to offend. She was not afraid to shock. Absolutely nothing was sacred. It was damn near feral at times. Ocean put some of the most vulgar and atrocious thoughts and feelings that humans are capable of having on display. And just when I thought this book couldn't surprise me anymore, shit got real weird real fast. And I loved every single page of it. I will never forget this read. And if you're looking for a comparison, this book made me feel the same way that I felt when I was reading Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. Not in plot, but definitely kind of in language and that raw, unfiltered, disturbed narrative. I haven't heard many people talk about this book, and I would love for more people to pick it up. But if you do, please proceed with caution and let me know what you think. All right, coming in at number 2, we have James by Percival Everett. And I am sure you are not surprised to see this book on my list. You knew it was coming, but you might be surprised that it's sitting in my number 2 spot. In any other year, this would have been number 1, but I read something that just absolutely blew my mind, but we'll get to that in a minute. As far as James goes, there's nothing else I could add to the conversation. This book is well loved. It's universally loved. There are very few people out there that have anything negative to say about it. I personally think that this is a book that's going to withstand the test of time. It's going to be a modern classic. It's going to be one that we're continuing to talk about for years to come. And yeah, I absolutely adored it. And if you haven't read it, what are you waiting for? All right, we have made it. So what is my number 1 read of the year? It was East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and it was published in 1952. The first thing that I will say about this book is, if you haven't read it, please just do it. Don't wait. If it's a book that you know that you want to read and you're going to get to it someday, just please pick it up and read it now. One of my biggest regrets after reading it is that I didn't read it earlier in my life, because this is a book that I feel like I could reread every year for the rest of my life and still get something different out of it. And I would have loved to have read it earlier in my life to know what my experience would have been reading it in my late teens, throughout my 20s, 30s, etc. This book withstands the test of time. It is a damn near perfect novel, if not perfect. This book has taken my favorite book of all time slot. This book is now my favorite. I did not expect this book to blow me away the way that it did. I knew it was going to be good. I knew it was going to be good, but I didn't know how good. And the reason that I read it this year was because of Jess at Stalking Kafka. She did a read-along of this book this year, and the way that she does her read-alongs is she does them through Voxer, which is a really cool app, and you're able to not just type conversations, so you have like your little written community, but you can also do voice recordings and hear what people are saying, and almost kind of like have a conversation. And it was such a unique experience to kind of buddy read this book along with this group of people. And we were all pulling out these little different things that, you know, I caught and then someone else caught or Jess caught. And we were just having these wonderful, amazing conversations. And it was not only a great reading experience, but the book, oh my gosh, this book. So for those of you that don't know, this book is based on the biblical story of Cain and Abel, and it follows two families. We have the Trasks and the Hamiltons. And as far as plot goes, I don't want to tell you the plot because I went into this book basically just knowing what I just told you and getting to learn every part of the plot was one of the most joyful reading experiences that I have ever had. And I will tell you though, the story not only touches on Cain and Abel, but there are lots of biblical references. So I also want to point out that don't let that put you off if you're not familiar with the Bible or you're not a religious person. You don't need to be in order to get what you need out of this book. This book explores so many themes. There were so many themes that were packed into this book, and it is a chunky book, but it did not feel like a chunky book. So the themes, I mean, they went from love, so not only romantic love, but familial love, platonic love. We had wonderful friendships throughout this book. We talked about obtaining acceptance from your parents and your family, good versus evil, nature versus nurture, the effects of guilt, the way that humans can self-sabotage. And then another theme that was a heavy undercurrent through the entire book was free will, whether we are destined to do certain things and if it's in the stars, or if we have choice, if we have the capacity to make those choices on our own and decide what our futures are going to look like and what we do. This was an absolute banger of a book, and for any of you that have ever read Steinbeck, if you haven't, you are absolutely missing out, because Steinbeck is a genius when it comes to setting the story and the scene. It is a masterclass on setting the scene. The landscapes, he gets you to visualize colors, he gets you to smell smells, you can taste things. And the very first chapter, there were times when I was reading this chapter, I'm not kidding you, I read the first chapter 5 times. It was the most beautiful landscape descriptions that I have ever read in my life. It was just stunning. But it even had, his narrative even had tactile qualities. You could hear the bugs buzzing around your ear. Like, it was a reading experience that I have never had before. It was perfectly plotted. It was perfectly paced, and it was such an emotional journey. The last line of the book, oh, it was so good. And it has it has the most memorable character I've ever read in Kathy Ames. If you have read the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you've got to read it. You absolutely have to read it. This book is phenomenal, and I know that I'm just gushing at this point, but I cannot say enough good things about it. And like I said, the only bad part of reading this book this year is that it's the first time I've read it, and I'm sad that I've missed out on it being a reread, because I would have loved to have read this book younger, and it's a book now that I will revisit periodically throughout the rest of my life because I loved it so much. So yeah, so that's it. Those are my favorite books of 2024, and yeah, it was a great reading year. I'm so glad. Each of these books that made my list, they're special to me in one way or another. And now that my list is done, I'm gonna actually get a chance to go and start watching some other people's. I have not let myself watch anybody's yet before I picked mine, because I didn't want any outside influences to alter what my list would be. But yeah, I'm so happy that you were all here with me for this past year of reading, and I'm really looking forward to great things for 2025 as far as content and books go. And until we read again, bye!